Thank you for having us. We're happy to present our outlook on ransomware and from our particular vantage point as a provider of disaster recovery and resiliency services. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors on this, Pure Storage and Veeam. In addition to myself, Dziak, CEO and Chairman of Recovery Point, I'm joined by Jeff Judy, our Chief Architect, who makes all of these things work within Recovery Point. So again, thank you for your time. Maybe a little bit about us. Recovery Point Systems provides disaster recovery and IT cyber resiliency services. We've been doing this for a fair amount of time, 40 plus years of service into the enterprise marketplace for DRaaS services. We support all technology platforms from x86 through Power Systems and through mainframe services. We run a Tier 3 2N data center in Germantown, Maryland, where we perform our disaster recovery services. We do physical and virtual recovery, and again, deliver cloud-based, shared, and dedicated resiliency services across all of those platforms. We've been recognized by Gartner as what they characterize as an evolved traditional disaster recovery provider for 8 consecutive years now. And we are 100% US based with US based support staff, which makes us very attractive to not only the enterprise world, but the SLED and government agency community. Moving on a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about disasters and cyber threats. Personally, I've been in disaster recovery for several decades now in a number of infrastructure businesses. And historically, a disaster has been really a physical disaster, very prevalent around hurricane season, weather-related disasters associated with issues in IT environments. But clearly, cyber threats are much more pernicious. They're much more widespread. They're much more frequent. And the way we characterize ransomware and cyber threats, it has the pattern of an EKG. They're up, they're down, but they're always there. And so an enterprise needs to be very prepared for itself to recover in the event of the inevitable, in the event of a cyber attack, in the event of a cyber threat. And that really changes the landscape and the manner in which you design your recovery program, let alone how you execute on your recovery program. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of those differences. From our vantage point, we're in the business of resiliency. For decades now, we've been doing work that builds resiliency plans within the enterprise, does that in concert with changes in production environments, catches those changes in production environments, and ensures that the resiliency plan is updated. But clearly, with ransomware, there's plenty of new wrinkles with introducing ransomware into a recovery plan. And that means partnering with a number of providers who are not only traditional infrastructure and data mover providers, but also with the broader cyber resiliency community. What I'm talking about here are the IRs, the MDRs, and other MSSPs, or managed security solution providers, who are at the point of the attack, during the attack. In order to understand what needs to be recovered, you have to understand the attack vector and the attack plane. In order to understand the attack plane, you have to be very conversant in the production environment and the vulnerabilities associated with that production environment. And so a resiliency plan needs to be in place. Attacks are not only, they're coming for your backups, they're coming for regular data backups, they're coming for encrypted backups, they're coming for the immutable and offline backups. And so therefore, identifying critical infrastructure, critical data, critical applications is extremely important in establishing your recovery plan or your resiliency plan in the face of ransomware attacks. And from our perspective, that impacts what we do daily, which is testing and validation. Testing an environment, testing your recovery plan, validating that recovery plan works so that when a ransomware attack occurs, you're able to recover in a relatively quick time span and be ready and available from a production environment perspective. And so we look at backup practices is really our to this is kind of 3, 2, 1, 1 and 0. 3 copies of your data, 2 different media types, 1 off-site, but in addition, 1 air gap disconnected from the network so that it is safe, so that it's secure, so that it's inaccessible to an attack, and it's ready to be, it's ready and available for recovery upon a ransomware attack, and ensuring that no errors occur as we manage the recovery through our automated capabilities around managed business process resilience solutions. And we'll talk about that. In a little bit. We don't do this alone. As a managed services provider for disaster recovery as a service, we rely upon the collaboration of all of the firms that you see here, including our co-sponsors, Pure Storage and Beam Solutions. You'll see a number of folks on there in the traditional infrastructure world, and a number of others who we continue to grow with in terms of delivery, again, around cyber resiliency, ransomware detection, and resiliency planning. But maybe a little bit about our view of the world around cyber resiliency. What does that mean for a provider of disaster recovery as a service? From our perspective, you have to continuously refresh your resiliency plan in light of the changes in the cyber ecosystem. So if I step back for a moment and talk about a typical day in the life of a disaster recovery as a service provider, one of the key things we need to do is to ensure that the production environment that we snap to when devising the initial recovery plan, that we're keeping abreast of all of those changes in the production environment. As that attack plane expands, as more vulnerabilities are exposed in the production environment, so too do those vulnerabilities need to be reflected and mitigated in our disaster recovery plan. And so we see a continuous loop of cyber preparedness and validation testing as those production environments not only change under their own steam, but as they change as a result of or in preparation for and in protection of that production environment for cybersecurity capabilities. We develop clean room solutions that allow for protected environments to which disaster recovery can occur, and then provide our services around recovering any post-ransomware attack. Now, as a pure play in resiliency, in stark contrast to many of our competitors, in fact, all of our competitors, we are a pure play in disaster recovery. And so we're increasingly aligning ourselves, as I mentioned earlier, with the managed security services providers so that we have a very tight linkage between recovery and resiliency tied to cybersecurity planning. Or cybersecurity planning is tied directly to disaster recovery planning, and vice versa. So we also play into the NIST cybersecurity planning: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And naturally, we would fall squarely into the recover side of the NIST cybersecurity framework. But increasingly, we're moving upstream into this framework, working with our partners to ensure that production environments are adequately protected, but that protection is reflected in the disaster recovery environment that sits on our floor with our customers, with our clients. Likewise, it's important that our clients are continuously detecting anomalies and events, continuously monitoring their security, and improving their detection processes, so that the environment that sits on our floor for recovery purposes, those detection processes and parameters are applied to that environment as well. Our roadmap increasingly reflects things like backup scanning to detect anomalies and backups, not only as they sit in the production environments, but as they're brought over into recovery environments in preparation for and anticipation of testing and recovery for disasters. So that does draw a distinction between traditional versus ransomware recovery, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. There's some fundamental differences between traditional DR and what we would call ransomware DR. Traditionally, DR has been about failover, recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives, and those tests certainly are and continue to be sequentially and scheduled on an annual, biannual, or increasingly on a quarterly basis to protect the enterprise. But with ransomware and cyber attacks increasingly posing threats to production environments, the unpredictable nature of those attacks has led to a frequency of disaster declaration, which in turn has led to a reprioritization of technology, applications, and processes in a very different way than with the traditional recovery plan. And so it's incumbent on us and our clients to ensure that the right data encryption is in place, that time sensitivity around those recovery plans are in place, and that we as a continuously test and validate those production environments, that they're protected from cyber attacks, but then in the event of an attack, that the recovery platforms in place are immutable and are immune from those types of attacks and threats. A couple of real world stories, and I want to throw it open to questions, and then I ask my colleague Jeff to comment as we get into the questions. We've had a number of instances over the course of the past 12 to 18 months where customers have declared, either during test or prior to a test, declared for a disaster as a result of a ransomware attack. In one particular instance, we had a customer declare a production environment attack and recover their environment on our floor. We were contracted for a relatively small portion of their production environment. But given the fact that we deliver hot site capabilities, namely that we have spare capacity for our customers on the floor, in the event that disasters are more pernicious than are contracted for, we were able to recover their entire production environment outside the contracted platforms, and then have that customer run their production environment on our floor for a period of about 2 months while they recovered back to their native production environment. We also hold ready our facilities and capabilities across our infrastructure platforms for customers to re-architect and reconfigure their production environments in the midst of an attack, so that they have a clean room environment in which they can work to ensure that they can bring their applications, they can bring their business processes, and they can bring their infrastructure back online even while the attack is ongoing. And that is a service offering and delivery capability that we offer to our customers. So with that, let me probably open this up now to questions from the crowd.
Great. I want to remind everybody, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Let's start with this one from Lynn, who's a frequent flyer. Hi, Lynn. How has the landscape of ransomware as a service evolved, and what impact does it have on the overall threat landscape? Are there new players or developments in this space?
So thank you, Lynn. I appreciate that. I think so. From a landscape perspective, let me take it from the perspective as a DRaaS provider. So we see the frequency of declarations. We see that customers, as they design their resiliency plans, looking to mitigate the risk of ransomware attacks by testing more frequently throughout the year, right? So to pick up the adage in the military, you fight like you train, and you train like you fight. Well, we follow the same kind of ethos, right? We train as if we were in a disaster, so that when the disaster strikes, the training pays off, and so that we cover those production environments readily and within the RTOs and the RPOs. I think from a landscape perspective, how has that changed? We're seeing recovery being consumed in different lot sizes, meaning that historically entire production environments would be contracted for recovery purposes. Now what we're seeing is an increased focus on prioritization at the application and infrastructure layer, so that some applications are created more equal than others because they're more subject to broader threats. That focuses us on delivering things like systems impact analyses with our partners, business impact analyses with our partners, in order to prioritize the application, the infrastructure, and the processes that require recovery in the event of a ransomware attack. Jeff, do you have anything you'd like to add on that?
Hey, Jack. Thanks. No, that was well said. I mean, we do see that definitely over the past 12 months, an uptick in ransomware attacks, and it is definitely continuing to increase as the attacks get more evolved, usually using things like that, what the presenters were showing earlier with ChatGPT and artificial intelligence. So, the main theme would be to be prepared, have an incident response plan, and then test, and test again.
Okay. Here's a question from Hannah, who's wondering, how can an organization prepare to recover from a ransomware incident or other disaster with a high change rate within the environment?
Sure. I can take that one. So, yep, even if with a high change rate in a ransomware and a disaster recovery planning, change control would be a key factor, even in a highly frequently changing environment. Some things that you can do to maintain change control in your environment would be things like managing your processes, your service tickets, change review board, code development, deployment, the vendor supports for hardware and software, technology strategies such as if you're moving to the cloud. All of these things you have to embed change control and a view of how does this affect disaster recovery into all of those processes. And then, as I said before, really more frequent disaster recovery testing. So if you leverage automation inside of the DR testing cycles, it'll help your teams become more efficient and reduce the amount of time that you spend sorting through things like how did this happen, who's in charge, why, the what's of all of the managing the systems and infrastructure.
And I'd add a few comments.
Sorry, go ahead.
Comments to that as well.
Yeah,
so,
please.
To Jeff's point, change management is part and parcel to everything you do in resiliency planning. You have to catch drift, right? You have to catch changes in production environments. That's why we do validation testing. That's why if ransomware didn't even exist, right? Production environments change very frequently. Workloads migrate to cloud. They go from on-prem to off-prem. They come back, right? Mainframes migrate to cloud or migrate to other environments. And so that's part and parcel to what we do. I'd say what's fundamentally changed is that there are more players involved in catching that drift as cybersecurity becomes a more pernicious threat, right? So that's why we partner with MDRs and IRs who stand at the ready and are responding to attacks as they occur. And what we do is we go through that planning. We take the threat log that they've captured to their intelligence and align that with changes that we see in the production environment. So what do I mean by that? When we see attacks forming in a certain fashion through our partners, we're able to prioritize the systems impact analyses. What's more vulnerable than other things, and so we adjust our testing, we adjust our resiliency planning accordingly, and then apply the tools like service automation at time of testing, time of declaration, that Jeff's talking about, so that when the disaster occurs, you're able to recover within your RTO and your RTO more effectively.
Okay, here's one from Patrick, he's asking a nomenclature question. What are immutable backups, and how do they differ from regular backups?
I could jump in here. So immutable backups are backups that can't be changed, they cannot be deleted or altered after they have been written. It's probably table stakes in today's world to have an immutable copy of your backup. Without it, you're really toast if you are to get hit with a ransomware event. With the immutable backups, you have the capability to go back in time. You may not be able to immediately recover your environment, But with those backups, it's a lifeline to be able to start to iterate through different recovery points and start to piece your systems and your data sets back together to bring your business back online.
Okay, here's one from Keith who's wondering, do recommendations change depending on data protection strategy chosen by an organization?
If I understand the question correctly, I'd say yes, right? So, data protection strategy will certainly inform the prioritization of application and infrastructure recovery, right? So I think data protection is a strategy and a process that's constantly evolving. Whether you're looking at structured or unstructured data, the rules and regulations around how that's encrypted and how that's managed internally within an enterprise from a process perspective certainly inform the disaster recovery process, again, whether ransomware existed or not. I think what we're seeing is that the changes in data protection strategies are more frequent, they're more in depth. The stakes for those data protection strategies are rising. We are seeing data protection, disaster recovery, and resiliency rising up to boards of directors, right? That those initiatives emanate from corporate boards. They become more than simple compliance. They become strategic imperatives for the enterprise, and that starts that data protection strategy.
Okay, here's an interesting one. If you're recovering from ransomware, how do you determine that the systems are no longer corrupted?
So there is tooling out there to be able to scan your systems and scan your backups, but that's not the silver bullet to bring your business back online. There's really more of a process and steps that you need to walk through to be able to bring everything back together. Even if you had immutable backups in place, you're not going to start recovering in 10 minutes. So you have to look at, is my backup clean? You have to look at what point in time do I recover from? There might be different data sets that you can't quite bring them all back on at the same time. And then, what are the additional tools, capabilities, processes that you'll need to reduce your downtime? So, some of the things that we offer, we have Recovery Point, we're disaster recovery service provider. We can provide you with an alternate data center or locations to begin your recovery processes. So sometimes in a ransomware event, your data center, your primary site is taped off, with police tape. You really can't touch it. And you may not have a complete set of equipment to start bringing all your systems back online. So you need that alternate location. On top of that, you need something like a clean room where it's completely isolated, because you may or may not really know that the backup has been affected. And so you need to bring systems back up inside an isolated environment and then have a process through a red, yellow, green level of sanitizing approach. You do a data set restoration. It's in the red zone. Your IR team starts to sanitize the system, ensures that it's clean, promote it to the yellow level, do another sanitizing sweep, and then put it in the green zone, because you don't want to risk reinfection from a corrupted backup, getting everything. Once you've spent many days, multiple hours, sleepless nights recovering, only to promote that last system into the green zone that still had the malware infected.
Here's one from Roland who's wondering, has cloud technology made recovery easier or more difficult?
That's a great question. It certainly made it more interesting. So a couple of things on cloud recovery. When you're talking about private cloud, we host our own private cloud on the recovery point systems floor in Germantown, Maryland. VMware-based cloud that our customers subscribe to. So cloud technology in and of itself is imminently recoverable. I think the issue becomes when workloads start to bleed off into the public cloud, and that changes your strategy, fairly significantly, right? And it also is a function of which cloud are you going to. you can, in theory, I think our perspective is that public cloud recovery is really about public cloud backup. You still have to manage the processes. You still have to manage the other technology elements because cloud is not delivered in isolation, which is why on our floor, we integrate with not only public and private cloud, but with power systems and mainframe, because we look at the business process is what needs to be recovered. And technology happens to be a driver of it. And so we look at public cloud as just yet another technology that we have to ingest into our underlying DVAS platforms. Now, when you introduce cyber attacks and ransomware into the public cloud sphere, that's where backup scanning becomes important, because you need to understand through anomaly testing and looking at the metadata of backups without having to decrypt the data, which is a service provider we cannot do. You start to look for anomalies in the backup so that you're applying the same principles to public cloud that you would to everything else. Ensure that you're not repatriating something that is compromised. And so I think it's applying the same principles and processes to a different technology platform, and that's part of our bread and butter.
Gotcha. Okay, here's an interesting question. What are the legal and ethical considerations associated with responding to ransomware attacks, especially when dealing with payment demands? Tough question.
That is a tough question, and I think it's that's a question that belongs in the boardrooms of our clients, right? And in the C-suite of our clients. We have many clients who have been subject to ransomware attacks, who paid out to stop those attacks, and as a result, have looked to entirely retool their entire disaster recovery strategy. So, from our perspective, it's a great question. It's very hard to answer from a legal and ethical perspective. I think from a business and technical perspective, it's, train, prepare. Ensure that from our perspective, we need to ensure that we're tied directly to the IRs and the MDRs who are manning the barricade to prevent attacks or at least to mitigate attacks once they occur, and ensure that that information is feeding into systems impact analysis and resiliency plans. And so it's a battle that never really ends. Saying goes, vigilance, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. It's kind of the same thing applies here. So I hope that answers at least in part of the question. It's a great question.
Okay, here's one from Doc, who asks, cost is always a concern for decision makers, especially for small and medium-sized organizations. In general, what kind of costs are we expecting for a robust disaster recovery solution?
Great question. I'd say it depends, right? So let me talk a little bit about cost structure. So part of our value proposition around resiliency is to be able to provide elastic capabilities, right? That's elastic technical, operational, and economic capabilities to handle the disaster. And so, our fixed cost is really turned into our client variable cost. And so we go through from the pre-sales solutioning, all the way through while we're deploying and running recovery environments, continuous refreshes on those platforms to ensure that we're delivering elastic capability, right? So as a production environment changes, and let's say a customer would go from a mainframe platform and ultimately migrate that off to some cloud instantiation, that DR plan and therefore our service flows with that, right? Which means that we're there at the table designing that migration from a DR perspective as they're designing that migration from a production perspective. For small and medium business, what that means is that we need to be able to provide a robust recovery capability when more often than not, those small and medium businesses are sitting in something like Azure and delivering their IT services through M365. You have solutions that are directly tied to recovery around M365. And so our structural advantage is to be able to provide that on an elastic, variable, and predictable basis from a cost perspective.
Okay, here's one that's kind of interesting. What is the ultimate air gap solution?
So, I mean, Jack talked about it earlier in the presentation. It's the 3-2-1-1-0 rule. That's really the ultimate. A lot of times these attacks will target your backups before they actually launch the attack. So if you follow that rule, it's going to give you a lifeline of recovery. 3-2-1-1-0 rule is 3 copies of data, 2 different media sets. That could be, you could keep it on tape, keep it in object storage like S3, disk or cloud, but 2 different media types. Keep 1 copy offsite, and then keep a copy offline. So a copy offline could be the immutable copy. You could have it in tape and put it in a vault offline, completely out of the tape library. And of course, the 0 in that is 0 errors. So make sure that those backups you test, that you can recover from them, and validate that frequently.
Okay, this is the age-old question here. How can you balance recovery requirements with budget constraints?
You're right, that is an age-old question. So I think there's a couple of ways to do that, right? So from our perspective, we deliver recovery as a service, resiliency as a service, and so therefore, you know, in the most simplistic formulaic is that we're delivering infrastructure on a variable recurring cost basis. Increasingly, from a contractual perspective, the industry, and you know, certainly we are asked to within the contract period, give customers the ability to flex in and out of capacity as their production environments change, as their business needs change, as their technical requirements change. And so that's something that we've been doing for quite some time, you know, frankly, you know, ahead of many of our competitors. I think the, you know, how do you maintain budget control is, you know, through governance. You know, because disaster recovery and the planning for that is taking on more and more of similar trappings as production planning, then more frequent interaction with our clients is first and foremost on our list of how to get a hold of that. You know, what we tend to do with our customers is hold quarterly business reviews. And those quarterly business reviews, you know, those agendas are expanding into the realm of cyber recovery and cyber resilience, principally so that we can understand what needs to be recovered, what priorities have changed as a result of attacks, and how do we align our environments in order to deliver on that UAS capability in an economically efficacious way for our clients. That translates into, you know, highly variable cost structures, which, you know, frankly go downstream to our vendors as well. And so we look to consume more and more of that infrastructure, more and more of that software, more and more of those business processes as a service on our own in order for us to deliver on those capabilities.
Okay, here's one from Henry, who's wondering, how often do you recommend DR and failover testing, and what tier should we be looking to reach?
I'll tackle the first part of that. I think I'll look to our customers to give us guidance on this, right? Good hygiene is annual, best hygiene. And, you know, each quarter, we have many customers who test quarterly, particularly some of our larger customers. And, you know, you test to see where the vulnerabilities are. And so what we look to do, particularly in quarterly testing, is to pick themes against those quarters. You know, test a certain application set in one particular quarter, test underlying infrastructure in another quarter, and ensure that feedback loop is going back to not only the people responsible for recovery, but up to the CIO and the CFO, you know, who own the business outcome of their IT infrastructure. Jeff, do you want to make some comments on the tiering side of that question?
Yeah, thanks. So it goes into doing an analysis up front, which would be something like a systems impact analysis, or a more in-depth business impact analysis to map the systems to the applications to the criticality of your company. And then you can start to assign those tier levels to each one of those systems or data sets. And then once you get into a testing cycle, tier one, it would be your most critical data sets. So you'd want to have an aggressive recovery point and recovery time objective to bring those systems back online quickly.
Okay, look, see, we've got important, maybe our last question. Let me see here. Last question would be, what are good steps for attendees? That was actually asked a couple of different ways throughout the talk.
Yeah, I'll keep it simple, right? I think the obvious one is to ensure that you've got a resiliency plan, and if you don't, start, right? Resiliency plans can start fairly basic and straightforward, and I'd start that from the business outcome and work your way down to the infrastructure. What are the most important business processes that, if threatened or if compromised, need to be recovered quickly? It gets right back to Jeff's comment on tiering and prioritization. Systems and business impact analyses are crucial in establishing that. So, A, ensure you have a resiliency plan. B, if you don't, get one. We are certainly capable of handling those types of things. That's what we do day in and day out. I think that the second bit is you can't do a resiliency plan in isolation, right? You have to tie that to the business owners. And so resiliency planning is not just about the infrastructure. It's not just about the application. It's about the business processes and ensuring that business outcomes can be delivered in the middle of literally in the middle of a hurricane, whether that's a hurricane or a digital hurricane. That's critical. If you don't have that planning, we see this a lot, right? Where customers come in, they do the testing, and it's very clear, and Jeff lives this day in and day out. It's very clear that they're not ready, right? You have to be ready, and it's some effort, but it's like any kind of training, right? The more you do it, the easier it becomes. The more you build muscle memory, right? And building that kind of technical and business process muscle memory on resiliency planning in the face of cyber attacks is going to be critical. In its absence, you're sunk.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Looks like that's all the questions we have time for in this session. Much appreciated.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You bet. And to the attendees, if we didn't get to your question or you think of one before we sign off here today, enter it into the console and we'll pass it along to Jack and Jeff, and I'm sure that they will do their best to get back to you.